On the night of November 14, 1940, 500 German bombers crossed the English Channel in perfect formation, guided not by stars or landmarks, but by invisible radio beams that drew them unerringly toward the ancient city of Coventry. What followed was devastation beyond measure, but what came before was perhaps even more remarkable. One young scientist who saw what no one else could and refused to look away. The story begins not with fire and destruction, but with silence and secrecy. In the uncertain winter of 1939, Britain had declared war on Nazi Germany in September. The expected bombardment had not yet come. Instead, there was waiting. A peculiar, nervous calm that would later be called the phony war. In government offices across London, civil servants and military officers tried to prepare for a conflict they could not yet imagine. Among them was a 28-year-old physicist named Reginald Victor Jones, a man whose face would remain unknown to the British public for decades, but whose mind would prove to be one of the war's most formidable weapons. Jones was not a soldier. He had never flown a combat mission, never commanded troops, never fired a weapon in anger. He was, by training and temperament, a scientist, a man who had spent his young career studying the behavior of light and the properties of matter at the Clarendon Laboratory in Oxford. He was methodical, precise, occasionally awkward in social situations, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to see patterns where others saw only noise. In the autumn of 1939, this unlikely warrior was recruited by the Air Ministry to serve in a newly formed section of intelligence, a shadowy department tasked with understanding the scientific capabilities of the enemy. His office was small, his staff nearly non-existent, his authority uncertain. But Reginald Jones had something that would prove more valuable than rank or resources, an unshakable belief in the power of evidence and a willingness to follow that evidence wherever it led, no matter how improbable the destination. The first clue arrived in late 1939, buried in a routine intelligence report. A German prisoner of war shot down over France had mentioned something during interrogation, a reference to X-Girat, a device that he claimed would allow the Luftwaffe to bomb targets with unprecedented accuracy, even in complete darkness. The interrogator had noted the comment but thought little of it. Navigation aids were common enough. The prisoner was probably exaggerating or confused or simply repeating propaganda he'd been told. Jones read the report differently. He had been trained to look for anomalies, for the data points that didn't fit the expected pattern. And this was an anomaly. The Luftwaffe was already known to be formidable, its pilots well-trained, its aircraft modern and effective. But precision bombing at night, in all weather conditions, without visual reference, that would represent a quantum leap in capability. If true, it would mean that German bombers could strike any target in Britain with impunity, guided by technology the British didn't even know existed. Jones began to dig. He requisitioned every intelligence file that mentioned German navigation systems. He interviewed pilots who had flown against the Luftwaffe. He studied captured documents, technical manuals, even propaganda broadcasts, searching for any reference to radio guidance, to beams, to automated systems. What he found was fragmentary and contradictory. A phrase here, a technical diagram there, scattered pieces of a puzzle whose shape he could not yet discern. Then, in early 1940, came a breakthrough of sorts. The British Signals Intelligence Network, the secret listeners at stations scattered across southern England, had begun to detect unusual radio transmissions emanating from Germany. The signals were powerful, directional, and seemed to follow regular patterns. They were not voice communications, not Morse code, not anything immediately recognizable. They operated on frequencies that had no obvious purpose, and they pointed toward Britain. Jones requested the raw intercept data. He spent days analyzing the signals, their timing, their characteristics, their geographic origin. And slowly, impossibly, a theory began to form. What if the signals were not communications at all, but navigation beams? What if German bombers were being guided to their targets by radio waves, invisible highways in the sky that would bring them precisely to their objective regardless of weather, darkness, or British defenses? It was an audacious idea. It was also, Jones believed, correct. The problem was convincing anyone else. In the spring of 1940, as German forces swept through Norway and prepared for the invasion of France, Reginald Jones found himself in a position that would have been absurd had it not been so consequential. A junior intelligence officer, barely into his 30s, trying to persuade some of Britain's most senior military commanders that they were wrong about the fundamental nature of the threat they faced. The resistance was immediate and formidable. Air marshals, men who had fought in the previous war, men with decades of experience, looked at this young scientist and saw presumption. Radio beams, guiding bombers across hundreds of miles. It was the stuff of science fiction, not warfare. Yes, radio existed. Yes, it could be used for basic navigation. But the precision Jones was describing, beams narrow enough to guide an aircraft to a specific building in a specific city, that would require technical sophistication far beyond what anyone believed the Germans possessed. Jones was asked, politely but firmly, if he had any concrete proof. He did not. Not yet. What he had was theory, intuition, and a growing collection of circumstantial evidence that would have convinced any scientist but which seemed hopelessly inadequate to military minds accustomed to dealing in certainties. He had intercepts showing unusual signals. He had prisoner statements that might mean anything or nothing. He had his own calculations showing that such a system was theoretically possible. But he did not have a photograph of a German bomber following a radio beam to its target. And so, through the spring of 1940, as France fell and Britain stood alone, Jones continued his lonely investigation. He was not ordered to stop. The Air Ministry was too overwhelmed with immediate crises to pay much attention to what seemed like an academic obsession, but neither was he given the resources or authority to pursue his theory with the urgency he believed it deserved. Then, on June 21, 1940, everything changed. An RAF intelligence officer named Charles Medhurst brought Jones a document that had been recovered from a crashed German bomber in France just before the final collapse. It was a technical manual, partially burned but still legible, describing a navigation system called Knickebein. The name meant crooked leg in German, a whimsical designation for what the manual described as a revolutionary bombing aid. The system used 2 radio beams transmitted from stations in Germany and occupied territory. The beams were narrow, focused, and powerful. A bomber equipped with the appropriate receiver could listen to the beams and use them to navigate. More importantly, where the beams intersected, where their paths crossed, that was the target. Jones read the manual 3 times. Then he began to smile. He had been right. The beams existed. But even with this evidence, skepticism remained. The manual described Knickebein as a navigation aid, but it was not clear how precise it actually was. Could it really guide bombers to specific buildings? Or was it merely a rough directional tool, useful for finding cities but nothing more? And if it was as accurate as Jones suspected, why hadn't the Germans used it already? The Blitz had not yet begun. German bombing raids on Britain had been limited, tactical, almost tentative. Where was this supposed technological superiority? Jones argued that the Germans were waiting, perfecting the system, training crews, preparing for a systematic campaign that would break British will and force surrender. The beams were there. The bombers were there. The attack was coming. Britain needed to act immediately to understand the system and, if possible, defeat it. Finally, reluctantly, the Air Ministry agreed to a test. On the night of June 21, 1940, the same day Jones received the Knickebein manual, an RAF aircraft was fitted with a special receiver designed to detect the frequencies Jones believed the Germans were using. The aircraft was piloted by a young officer named H.E. Buffton, a man chosen for his technical competence and his willingness to fly a mission that many considered pointless. Buffton was given coordinates where Jones calculated a beam should be found, based on the location of German transmitter stations and the likely target, the Rolls-Royce factory at Derby, a crucial facility producing Merlin engines for RAF fighters. Buffton took off into a clear summer night. He climbed to 15,000 feet and flew toward the coordinates Jones had provided. His radio operator scanned the designated frequencies, listening through static and interference for something that shouldn't be there. At 22 minutes past midnight, they found it. The signal was unmistakable, a steady, directional radio beam, strong and clear, exactly where Jones had predicted. As Buffton flew along the beam, the audio changed. Dots on one side, dashes on the other, a steady tone when the aircraft was perfectly centered. It was, in every respect, an invisible road in the sky, leading directly toward Derby. The test flight continued for 2 hours. Buffton and his crew followed the beam, documenting its characteristics, its width, its stability. They found a second beam, intersecting the first almost precisely over the Rolls-Royce factory. The accuracy was remarkable, within a few hundred yards, even from transmitters located hundreds of miles away in Germany. When Buffton landed and delivered his report, the tone of the conversation changed immediately. This was not theory. This was not speculation. This was a documented, measured, undeniable reality. The Germans had built an invisible network of radio beams that crisscrossed British airspace, marking their most important industrial and military targets with the precision of crosshairs in a gun sight. Reginald Jones had been vindicated. Now he had to figure out how to defeat it. The science behind Nicobene was, in principle, straightforward, which made it all the more dangerous. Radio waves, like light waves, can be focused and directed. By using large antennas and high-power transmitters, the Germans had created narrow beams of radio energy that propagated across hundreds of miles with minimal spreading. A bomber equipped with a simple receiver, essentially a modified Lorenz blind landing system, already standard equipment on many German aircraft, could detect these beams and use them for navigation. The genius of the system lay not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. The pilot didn't need to understand radio theory or perform complicated calculations. He simply had to listen. If he heard dots, he was to the left of the beam and should turn right. If he heard dashes, he was to the right and should turn left. When the dots and dashes merged into a steady tone, he was flying along the center line of the beam, heading directly toward his target. For precision bombing, the Germans used 2 or more beams. The primary beam, transmitted from one station, would guide the bomber along its approach path. A second beam, transmitted from a different location, would cross the first beam at a predetermined point, the target. When the pilot heard the second beam signal, he knew he was approaching the release point. When the signals merged, indicating he was at the exact intersection of the 2 beams, he dropped his bombs. In theory, the system could guide a bomber to within a few hundred yards of its target from distances of 300 miles or more, in complete darkness, through clouds, in any weather conditions that would allow flight. It was a technology that rendered Britain's primary defense, the difficulty of finding targets at night, essentially meaningless. Jones understood immediately that Britain faced 2 urgent challenges. First, the country needed to map the entire network of German beams. Every transmitter, every beam path, every target they marked. Second, and more critically, Britain needed to find a way to neutralize the beams without alerting the Germans that their secret system had been compromised. The first challenge was a matter of systematic intelligence work. Jones organized a program of aerial reconnaissance using specially equipped RAF aircraft to fly regular missions detecting and documenting German radio beams. Ground stations were established to monitor German transmissions continuously. Every new beam was plotted, its path calculated, its target identified. Within weeks, Jones and his team had mapped more than 30 distinct beams covering virtually every major industrial center, port, and military installation in Britain. The target list was sobering: aircraft, factories, shipyards, munitions plants, railway junctions, radar stations. The Germans had planned their campaign with meticulous care, identifying the strategic pressure points whose destruction would cripple Britain's ability to continue the war. But knowing where the beams were was only the first step. The real challenge was defeating them. Jones considered and rejected several approaches. The most obvious solution, jamming the beams with powerful radio interference, would immediately alert the Germans that their system had been discovered. They would change frequencies, modify their equipment, or devise countermeasures, beginning a technological arms race that Britain, with its limited resources and industrial capacity, might not win. Whatever solution Jones devised needed to be subtle enough that the Germans would attribute navigation failures to weather, equipment malfunction, or pilot error. Anything except enemy action. The answer, when it came, was both elegant and audacious. Instead of trying to block the German beams, Britain would create false beams of its own. The plan, codenamed Aspirin, by the deliberately uninformative bureaucracy that governed such matters, worked as follows. British transmitters, carefully positioned and calibrated, would broadcast signals on the same frequencies as the German beams, but slightly offset in direction. A German bomber, flying along what its crew believed to be the true beam, would actually be following a combination of the German signal and the British interference. The offset would be subtle, just a degree or two, but over a distance of hundreds of miles, that small deviation would translate into several miles of error. The bomber would think it was over its target when it was actually over empty countryside, or, even better, a decoy site where false fires and lights would simulate a successful hit. The technical challenges were formidable. British transmitters had to operate on precisely the same frequency as the German beams, synchronized to within fractions of a second. The power levels had to be carefully calibrated. Too weak, and the interference would be ineffective. Too strong, and the Germans would detect the obvious jamming. The directional antennas had to be positioned to create the desired deflection without disrupting the entire beam structure, which would again alert the enemy that something was wrong. Jones assembled a team of engineers, radio specialists, and mathematicians. They worked from a facility codenamed 80 Wing, operating from requisitioned buildings scattered across southern England, always moving, always hidden, a secret within a secret. The equipment they built was experimental, untested, assembled from whatever components could be scrounged from laboratories and workshops. There was no time for proper testing, no opportunity for refinement. The first masking beacons, as they were called, had to work on the first attempt because there might not be a second chance. The system went operational in late June 1940, just as the German bombing campaign began in earnest. The initial results were encouraging but inconclusive. German bombers were missing their targets, but not by enough to indicate the beams were completely ineffective. Damage was scattered across wider areas. Bombs fell on residential neighborhoods miles from their intended targets. Whether this was due to British interference or simply poor German execution was impossible to determine from the outside. Jones analyzed the bombing patterns obsessively, looking for statistical evidence that the British countermeasures were working. He plotted impact points, calculated deviation patterns, compared results before and after the masking beacons were activated. Slowly, a pattern emerged. When British interference was active, German bombing accuracy declined by approximately 30 to 40%. Not perfect, but significant. Factories that should have been destroyed were instead merely damaged. Ports that should have been closed remained partially operational. British war production continued, diminished but not eliminated. But the Germans, for their part, were not standing still. In August 1940, Jones began receiving reports of a new and more sophisticated German navigation system. Intercepted radio traffic mentioned X-Gerat, the system the prisoner had described almost a year earlier. Unlike Nicobene, which was relatively simple and had been fitted to large numbers of German bombers, X-Gerat appeared to be more complex and more precise, reserved for an elite unit of specially trained crews. Jones tasked his aerial reconnaissance units with finding evidence of X-Gerat transmissions. It took 3 weeks of systematic searching, but they eventually located the signals. A series of new beams operating on different frequencies, with a much more elaborate structure than Nicobene. The X-Gerat system, as Jones and his team painstakingly reconstructed it, represented a significant advancement in sophistication. Instead of using simple beam intersections, X-Gerat employed a timing mechanism to achieve pinpoint accuracy. The system used one primary beam, along which the bomber would fly, and 3 crossbeams positioned at precise distances before the target. As the bomber approached along the primary beam, it would first encounter a preliminary crossbeam, 30 kilometers before the target. This triggered a clock in the aircraft's X-Gerat equipment. 20 kilometers later, the bomber would cross a main beam, which started a second timing mechanism. Finally, 5 kilometers from the target, the bomber would cross the fine beam. The equipment would automatically calculate the aircraft's speed based on the time intervals between beams and would then automatically release the bombs at the precise moment to hit the target, compensating for wind, altitude, and aircraft velocity. The human element and its potential for error was largely removed from the equation. The X-Jet bomber was, in effect, an early guided missile, piloted by humans but aimed by machines. Jones realized immediately that the masking beacon technique used against Nicobene would be far less effective against X-Jet. The system's reliance on precise timing rather than simple directional guidance meant that small angular deflections would not significantly degrade its accuracy. A more sophisticated countermeasure was required. The solution came from one of Jones's team members, a radio engineer named Robert Cockburn. Instead of trying to deflect the beams, Cockburn proposed creating false crossbeams, British transmissions that would mimic the German signals but would be positioned at incorrect distances from the target. The X-Jet equipment in German bombers would detect these false beams and would calculate its position based on incorrect information. The automatic bomb release would trigger too early or too late, sending bombs harmlessly into empty fields. The plan was ingenious but required exquisite precision. British transmitters had to replicate not just the frequency of German signals, but also their exact modulation characteristics, the specific pattern of radio waves that the X-Jet receivers would recognize as authentic. The timing had to be perfect. False beams transmitted too early would be ignored. Transmitted too late would allow German bombers to successfully complete their missions before British interference took effect. The necessary equipment was designed, built, and deployed in a matter of weeks, a remarkable achievement given the technical complexity and the primitive state of electronics in 1940. Ground stations were established near likely German target zones. Operators were trained to recognize the characteristics of X-Jet transmissions and to activate the false beams at precisely the right moments. Everything was ready by mid-September, and then, on September 14, 1940, the first major X-Jet raid took place. The target was London. The attacking force was Kampfgruppe 100, an elite unit of the Luftwaffe specially equipped with X-Jet and specially trained in its use. These were not ordinary bomber crews, they were pathfinders, meant to mark targets with incendiary bombs that following waves of conventional bombers would then use as aiming points. If successful, Kampfgruppe 100 would multiply the effectiveness of the entire German bombing campaign. Jones and his team monitored the raid from their operations center, listening to the radio intercepts, tracking the German beams, coordinating the British false beam transmissions. The tension was extraordinary. Everything they had built, every theory they had developed, every piece of equipment they had constructed, all of it was about to be tested in combat for the first time. The German bombers crossed the English coast shortly after dark. They flew along the primary X-Jet beam, heading directly toward London's docklands. British countermeasures activated. False beams transmitted, and then, gradually, reports began arriving. Bombs falling south and east of their intended targets. Incendiaries landing in the River Thames, in empty lots, in areas far from any important industrial facilities. The attack was not a complete failure. Some bombs hit their targets through a combination of luck and the sheer density of structures in London, but it was far less effective than it should have been. German post-raid reconnaissance would show scattered damage instead of the concentrated destruction that X-Jet was designed to produce. Jones allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Then he returned to work, because he knew the Germans would not give up easily. The Battle of the Beams entered a new phase. Action and reaction. Measure and countermeasure, an invisible technological duel fought in the electromagnetic spectrum, while the visible war raged overhead. Each time Jones and his team developed an effective counter to a German system, the Germans would modify their equipment or develop new variants. And each time the Germans introduced a new system, Jones would have to identify it, understand it, and find a way to defeat it, all while maintaining the illusion that nothing unusual was happening. The strain was enormous. Jones worked 18-hour days, sometimes sleeping at his desk, sustained by tea and cigarettes and the knowledge that every hour of delay potentially meant British lives lost. His team expanded from a handful of specialists to dozens of engineers, mathematicians, radio operators, and intelligence analysts, all working in conditions of extreme secrecy, unable to discuss their work even with colleagues in other departments. And yet, despite the pressure, despite the exhaustion, there was also exhilaration. This was science not as an academic exercise but as a weapon, as immediate and consequential as any gun or bomb. Every equation Jones wrote, every signal his team intercepted, every countermeasure they deployed, these were not abstractions but direct interventions in the course of the war. The connection between intellectual work and physical reality had never been more clear or more urgent. By October 1940, Jones had identified a third German beam system, even more sophisticated than X-Gerat. This one was codenamed Y-Gerat, and it represented a fundamentally different approach to radio navigation. Unlike Nickebein and X-Gerat, which were essentially one-way systems, transmitters on the ground, receivers in aircraft, Y-Gerat was a two-way system. A single beam transmitted from Germany would guide the bomber along its approach path, just as before. But instead of using crossbeams to determine position, Y-Gerat used a ranging system. The ground station would send a radio signal to the aircraft. The aircraft's equipment would immediately retransmit it back. By measuring the time delay, the interval between transmission and reception, the ground station could calculate the precise distance to the aircraft. Combined with the directional information from the beam, this gave the ground controllers perfect knowledge of the bomber's position. At the appropriate moment, calculated by computers on the ground, the controllers would send a command signal to the aircraft's equipment, which would automatically release the bombs. The bomber crew, in effect, became passengers. The entire bombing mission was controlled remotely from Germany, with a precision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Jones recognized Y-Gerat as perhaps the most dangerous system yet. It was less dependent on beam accuracy than Nickebein, less vulnerable to false beams than X-Gerat, and its two-way nature made it much harder to interfere with without being detected. The obvious countermeasure, jamming the return signal from the aircraft, would immediately alert the Germans that their system had been compromised. The solution, when Jones finally conceived it, was both brilliant and devious. Instead of jamming the return signal, British transmitters would mimic it. A ground station would listen to the interrogation signal sent from Germany to the German bomber. Before the bomber's equipment could respond, the British station would transmit a false response, reporting an incorrect position. The German ground controllers, receiving what they believed was the aircraft's actual location, would calculate the bomb release point based on false data. The bombs would be released at the wrong time, falling miles from their target. The technical challenge was the timing. The British false response had to arrive at the German ground station before the actual response from the bomber, a margin measured in microseconds. It required positioning British transmitters closer to Germany than the bomber's position, which meant placing equipment near the English coast within easy reach of German bombing and potentially exposing the whole operation. Jones approved the plan anyway. The alternative, allowing Y-Gerat to operate unchallenged, was unacceptable. The countermeasures went operational in late October 1940. Almost immediately, Y-Gerat operations became unreliable from the German perspective. Bombs fell unpredictably. The automatic release system seemed to malfunction. German crews reported anomalies, equipment failures, inexplicable navigation errors. But because the symptoms were inconsistent and could plausibly be attributed to technical problems with the still experimental Y-Gerat equipment, the Germans did not immediately suspect enemy action. By November 1940, 3 months after the Battle of Britain had begun, Reginald Jones and his team had achieved something remarkable. They had systematically identified and neutralized every German radio navigation system, degrading the accuracy of German bombing by an estimated 40 to 50%. Cities that should have been destroyed remained functional. Factories that should have been obliterated continued producing aircraft and weapons. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous. Bombs were still falling. People were still dying. but the campaign was not achieving its strategic objectives. But then came Coventry. The night of November 14, 1940, remains one of the most controversial episodes of the entire war, and Reginald Jones found himself at the center of a moral dilemma that would haunt him for the rest of his life. British intelligence had, by this time, achieved something even more remarkable than defeating the German beam systems. They had broken the German Enigma encryption system. Not consistently, not completely, but enough to occasionally read highly classified German military communications. This intelligence, codenamed Ultra, was perhaps Britain's most valuable secret, more important than radar, more important than any single weapon or technology. Its protection was paramount. If the Germans even suspected that Enigma had been compromised, they would change their encryption procedures, and Britain would be blind. On November 12th, 2 days before the raid, Ultra intercepts revealed that the Luftwaffe was planning a massive attack using the code name Moonlight Sonata. The target was not explicitly stated, but intelligence analysts believed it was Coventry, an industrial city in the English Midlands that housed numerous aircraft factories, machine tool manufacturers, and other facilities critical to the British war effort. The question was what to do with this information. If Britain evacuated Coventry, if they reinforced its defenses beyond normal levels, if they took any action that would indicate foreknowledge of the attack, German intelligence might realize their communications had been compromised. The value of Ultra, the ability to read German military plans for the remainder of the war, could be lost. On the other hand, doing nothing meant allowing German bombers to devastate a British city, killing potentially thousands of civilians. The decision was made at the highest levels of British government. Coventry's defenses would not be reinforced. There would be no evacuation. British countermeasures against the German beams would operate normally, but nothing extraordinary would be done. The secret of Ultra had to be protected, even at the cost of British lives. Reginald Jones was not part of this decision. His security clearance did not extend to Ultra, but he was aware of the impending attack. His beam monitoring network had detected unusual preparations, including the activation of additional X-Jurat transmitters and what appeared to be special beam configurations. Something large was coming, though he did not know exactly when or where. On the evening of November 14th, German bombers began assembling over France. First came the pathfinders of Kampfgruppe 100, equipped with X-Jurat, tasked with marking the target with incendiaries. Behind them came wave after wave of conventional bombers, more than 400 aircraft in total, the largest concentration of bombing power the Luftwaffe had yet assembled. Jones's countermeasures were active. False X-Jurat beams were transmitting. Y-Jurat responses were being mimicked. Everything that could be done, within the constraints of maintaining secrecy, was being done. It was not enough. The problem was one of scale. British countermeasures were designed to degrade the accuracy of German bombing, to scatter the impact points, to prevent concentrated destruction of specific targets. Against normal raids, this was effective. But against an attack of this magnitude, with this many aircraft, even degraded accuracy still meant catastrophic destruction. The Pathfinders crossed the English coast at 8 in the evening. They followed their X-Jurat beams, the real ones visible to them through the false ones, toward Coventry. British false beams deflected some of them, but not all. Those that remained on course dropped their incendiaries, creating fires that could be seen for miles. Visible markers that the following waves of bombers could use even without sophisticated navigation equipment. By 9 o'clock, Coventry was burning. The city's fire services, overwhelmed by the sheer number of fires, could do little but try to keep the flames from spreading. High explosive bombs fell alongside incendiaries, destroying water mains and preventing effective firefighting. The city's medieval center, with its narrow streets and timber-framed buildings, became an inferno. The raid continued for 11 hours. When dawn came on November 15th, the destruction was staggering. More than 500 tons of explosives and nearly 900 incendiary bombs had fallen on the city. The city center was gutted. The medieval cathedral was a burned-out shell. Residential neighborhoods were flattened. More than 500 people were dead. Thousands more injured or homeless. Critical factories were damaged or destroyed. The city's infrastructure, water, electricity, transportation, was in ruins. Jones received the damage reports in his office on the morning of the 15th. He had not slept. He read through the casualty lists, the descriptions of destruction, the assessments of damage to industrial facilities, and felt the weight of something that might have been failure or might have been an inevitable consequence of war's mathematics. His countermeasures had worked, in the technical sense. German bombing accuracy had been degraded. Analysis would later show that without British interference, the damage to Coventry would have been significantly worse, perhaps catastrophically so. Many bombs had fallen outside the city center, into fields and open areas where they did no harm. Some of the Pathfinder crews had been unable to mark their targets effectively, leading following bombers to attack empty areas. But technical success felt hollow when measured against the human cost. 500 dead was still 500 dead. The fact that it might have been 1,000 did not make those deaths easier to accept. The controversy over Coventry persists to this day. Some historians argue that Churchill and the British leadership could have done more to defend the city without compromising Ultra. Others maintain that any unusual defensive measures would have alerted the Germans that their communications were compromised, potentially costing many more lives in the long run. The truth, like so many truths about the war, is complex and uncomfortable. What is certain is that Reginald Jones, sitting in his office on that November morning, felt the full weight of scientific warfare's moral ambiguity. His work had saved lives. That was undeniable. British war production had continued when it might have been destroyed. Civilian casualties across Britain were lower than they would have been without his countermeasures. But he could not save everyone, and the people he could not save were just as dead as if he had never done anything at all. There was no time for reflection, no opportunity to process the trauma. The war continued. The Germans would mount more raids. Jones had to return to work. In the weeks following Coventry, the dynamic of the air war began to shift. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign, which had promised to break British will and force surrender, was achieving neither objective. The degraded accuracy meant that German resources were being expended inefficiently. Bombs wasted on targets of no strategic value. British war production, while damaged, remained functional. Fighter production was actually increasing. Public morale, though shaken, had not collapsed. German military planners began to question the effectiveness of their beam navigation systems. Reports from bomber crews were contradictory. Some claimed the systems worked perfectly, others reported constant malfunctions and unexplained errors. The Luftwaffe's technical staff investigated, testing equipment, interrogating crews, trying to understand why their scientifically advanced systems were producing such inconsistent results. They never suspected the truth. The British countermeasures were so subtle, so carefully calibrated, that they looked like equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference rather than deliberate enemy action. Jones's greatest achievement was not just defeating the German beams, but doing so invisibly, maintaining the deception for months, preventing the Germans from adapting or developing effective countermeasures. By the spring of 1941, the intensity of the German bombing campaign had begun to decline. This was partly due to Jones's work. The Luftwaffe's inability to achieve decisive results made the strategic bombing of Britain seem like an inefficient use of resources. But it was primarily due to a much larger strategic shift. Hitler had decided to invade the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe's bombers were needed in the East for the massive campaign that would begin in June 1941. For Britain, this was a respite, though not a victory. The threat of invasion receded. The Blitz gradually ended, replaced by smaller raids and then eventually by relative quiet. Cities began to rebuild. Life began, tentatively, to return to something approaching normality. But Reginald Jones's work was far from over. The defeat of the beam systems was only the beginning of what would become a comprehensive effort to understand and counter every aspect of German military technology. Jones's intelligence section, proven effective, was expanded and given broader authority. He was no longer a lone analyst pursuing an improbable theory. He was the head of a sophisticated scientific intelligence organization with resources, staff, and direct access to the highest levels of British military command. The focus shifted from defensive measures to broader intelligence gathering. What other technological surprises did the Germans have in development? What secret weapons were being tested? Where were they being built? And how could they be disrupted? In June 1941, the same month that Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Jones received a report from a Danish intelligence source. The report described unusual activity at a remote location on the Baltic coast, a place called Peenemünde. There were large facilities under construction, rocket motors being tested, strange cylindrical objects being transported by rail. The Danish source didn't know what was happening, but believed it was something important, possibly related to new German weapons. Jones added Peenemünde to his list of intelligence priorities. Aerial reconnaissance aircraft were tasked to photograph the site. Agents were asked to gather information. And Jones himself began studying the technical literature on rocketry, trying to understand what the Germans might be attempting. What he eventually discovered would make the beam system seem almost quaint by comparison. The Germans were developing ballistic missiles, rockets capable of traveling hundreds of miles and delivering explosive warheads with minimal warning. These were the V-weapons, Vergeltungswaffen, vengeance weapons, that would terrorize London in 1944 and 1945. But in 1941, they were still under development, and Jones's early intelligence gave Britain crucial years to prepare defenses and prioritize bombing raids on the production facilities. The pattern was the same as with the beams. Find the evidence, understand the technology, develop countermeasures. Do so faster than the enemy can adapt. It was scientific intelligence as a form of warfare, as vital as radar or code breaking or any conventional weapon. Jones also became involved in investigating German nuclear research. Reports from occupied Europe suggested that German scientists were exploring the possibility of atomic weapons, though the exact status of their program was unclear. Jones coordinated intelligence gathering, analyzing captured documents, interviewing refugees and defectors, trying to determine whether Britain faced yet another technological threat. The conclusion, eventually, was that while German nuclear research was advanced, it was not as far along as Allied programs, and was unlikely to produce a functional weapon before the war's end. This intelligence was crucial for Allied strategic planning, removing one potential nightmare scenario from the already crowded field of wartime fears. Throughout all of this, Jones maintained the methodical, evidence-based approach that had served him so well with the beam systems. He refused to accept claims without proof, refused to dismiss possibilities without investigation, and refused to let his own assumptions override the data. This scientific discipline, applied to the chaotic world of intelligence and warfare, produced consistently accurate assessments that shaped British and later Allied strategy. He was not always right. Intelligence is an imperfect art, and even the best analysis cannot compensate for incomplete information or deliberate enemy deception. But Jones was right more often than not, and his occasional errors were failures of data rather than failures of method. By 1943, as the tide of the war turned decisively against Germany, Jones's role evolved from reactive intelligence, understanding enemy systems as they appeared, to proactive technological assessment. British and American forces were now on the offensive, and planners needed to know what they would face when they invaded occupied Europe. Jones's organization provided detailed assessments of German radar systems, defensive technologies, weapon capabilities, anything that might affect Allied operations. The value of this work cannot be overstated. Modern military operations depend on accurate intelligence, and World War II was the first conflict where scientific and technical intelligence was recognized as essential rather than supplementary. Jones and his team created many of the methods and practices that would later become standard in military intelligence organizations worldwide. After the war ended in 1945, much of Jones's work remained classified. The beam systems were gradually declassified over the following decades, but other aspects of his work, particularly those related to code breaking and nuclear intelligence, remained secret for much longer. Jones himself returned to academic life, teaching at the University of Aberdeen, writing scientific papers, and gradually, carefully, telling the story of the secret war he had fought. His memoir, published in 1978 under the title Most Secret War, provided the first comprehensive public account of the Battle of the Beams and the broader scientific intelligence effort. It became a classic of military history, revealing for the first time how close Britain had come to defeat and how a small group of scientists and engineers had helped turn the tide. The book also revealed the human cost. Jones wrote movingly about the pressure of his work, the burden of knowledge, the impossible decisions made under conditions of uncertainty and fear. He wrote about Coventry, about the lives that were saved and the lives that were lost, about the moral complexity of warfare where technical success and ethical righteousness do not always align. In his later years, Jones became an advocate for the importance of scientific literacy in government and military leadership. He argued that the technological nature of modern warfare demanded that decision-makers understand basic scientific principles, that they be able to evaluate technical claims critically, and that they recognize both the potential and the limitations of technology as a military tool. He also reflected on the nature of the intelligence work he had done. In a lecture delivered in 1975, Jones spoke about the importance of the dog that didn't bark, the intelligence principle that absence of evidence can itself be evidence, that what the enemy doesn't say or doesn't do can be as revealing as what they actually say and do. This insight, drawn from his experience with the beam systems, became a foundational principle in intelligence analysis. The Battle of the Beams had broader implications for the development of modern warfare. The techniques Jones and his team developed, signal intelligence, electronic warfare, technological deception, became central to military operations in every conflict that followed. The Cold War was, in many respects, an extension of the invisible technological duel that Jones had pioneered, scaled up to nuclear weapons and global espionage. The beam systems themselves continued to influence military technology long after the war. Post-war guidance systems for aircraft and missiles drew on the principles the Germans had developed and the countermeasures the British had devised. The evolution of precision-guided weapons, satellite navigation, and modern air defense systems all trace their lineage, in part, to the work done by both sides in that invisible war over Britain in 1940 and 1941. The legacy is also evident in the structure of modern military intelligence organizations, the integration of scientific expertise into intelligence work, the creation of specialized technical analysis units, the emphasis on understanding enemy capabilities through careful investigation of physical evidence. All of these were either pioneered or significantly advanced by Jones and his colleagues. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of the Beams demonstrated that technological superiority is not absolute. The Germans had, in 1939 and 1940, a genuine advantage in navigation and bombing technology. Their beam systems were sophisticated, well-engineered, and should have given them a decisive capability. But that advantage was neutralized by a smaller, less well-funded British effort that compensated for its limitations through intelligence, creativity, and systematic scientific investigation. This lesson, that technological competition is as much about intellectual flexibility and organizational effectiveness as it is about engineering capability, shaped defense planning for decades. It suggested that technological surprise could be countered, that enemy innovations could be defeated, and that the side that learned faster and adapted better could overcome even significant initial disadvantages. The human dimension of this story is equally important. Reginald Jones was not a superhero, not a fictional genius, but a real person with limitations and doubts and fears. He succeeded not because he was infallible, but because he was systematic, because he trusted evidence over intuition, and because he was willing to pursue uncomfortable truths even when they contradicted conventional wisdom. His team, likewise, were ordinary people doing extraordinary work under extraordinary circumstances. Radio operators listening to static-filled signals for hours on end. Engineers building experimental equipment with inadequate tools and insufficient time. intelligence analysts piecing together fragments of information from prisoner interrogations and captured documents, pilots flying dangerous reconnaissance missions over enemy territory, the collective effort of hundreds of individuals, most of whose names are now forgotten, who together accomplished something remarkable. The moral questions raised by Coventry and similar operations remain unresolved. Was it right to sacrifice some lives to potentially save many more? Could Britain have defended the city more effectively without compromising Ultra? These questions have no easy answers, and historians continue to debate them. What is clear is that the people involved, Jones, Churchill, military commanders, did not make these decisions lightly. They were faced with impossible choices and did the best they could with imperfect information and conflicting responsibilities. This moral complexity is itself an important part of the story. The Battle of the Beams was not a clean, simple tale of good versus evil, of technological triumph without cost. It was a messy, complicated, often painful struggle where victories were partial and losses were real, where doing the right thing was not always clear and where even success came with a price. In 1982, Reginald Jones was knighted for his contributions to scientific intelligence. He continued to write and lecture until his death in 1997 at the age of 86. In his final years, he worked to ensure that the story of the Invisible War was not forgotten, that the lessons learned were preserved, and that the sacrifices made were remembered. One of his last published papers, written in 1996, reflected on the relationship between science and warfare. He argued that while technology could amplify the destructiveness of war, it could also create new possibilities for defense and survival. The beam systems, he wrote, were designed to kill, but the effort to defeat them had saved lives. This paradox, that the same scientific principles could be used for both destruction and protection, was, he believed, fundamental to understanding the role of technology in human affairs. Jones also wrote about the importance of curiosity as a strategic asset, the quality that had led him to investigate the cryptic mention of exjurat in a prisoner interrogation, the instinct that had made him question conventional wisdom about German capabilities, the persistence that had driven him to continue his investigation even when others doubted. These traits, he argued, were as important to Britain's survival as any weapon or technology. In a sense, the Battle of the Beams was won not by equipment or organization, but by one man's refusal to accept that he didn't know something important. Jones saw patterns where others saw noise. He asked questions when others were satisfied with assumptions. He insisted on evidence when others relied on intuition. And in doing so, he changed the course of history. The ultimate irony is that Hitler's Germany, so proud of its technological prowess, so confident in its scientific superiority, was undone in part by a single British physicist who understood science better than propaganda. The Nazi regime invested enormous resources in developing advanced weapons and systems, from beam navigation to rockets to jet aircraft. They believed that technological superiority would compensate for other weaknesses, that German engineering would overcome any obstacle. But technology is only as effective as the system that deploys it. The German beam systems were technically excellent, but they were defeated by an opponent who was more adaptable, more creative, and more willing to question assumptions. The Luftwaffe's rigid hierarchies and bureaucratic inflexibility meant that reports of navigation problems were attributed to equipment failure or crew error, rather than investigated as potential evidence of enemy action. The Germans never suspected that their beams were being systematically countered because they could not imagine an enemy capable of such sophistication. This failure of imagination, this inability to conceive that the enemy might be as capable or more capable than themselves, was a recurring theme in German military planning throughout the war. It led to underestimation of Soviet resistance, to miscalculation of American industrial capacity, and to the disastrous assumption that technological surprise would remain surprising indefinitely. Jones and Britain represented the opposite approach: constant vigilance, systematic investigation, and the assumption that the enemy was always doing something unexpected. This mindset, born of necessity, Britain could not afford any surprises, created an intelligence culture that was more effective than Germany's despite having fewer resources. The Battle of the Beams thus becomes a metaphor for the larger conflict. Germany had advantages in technology, training, and preparation. Britain had disadvantages in almost every measurable category. And yet Britain survived and eventually prevailed, not through superior force, but through superior adaptation. This is the lesson that Reginald Jones wanted future generations to understand. That intelligence, in both senses of the word, is a force multiplier that can overcome material disadvantage. That curiosity and skepticism are strategic virtues. That the ability to learn from evidence is more valuable than the ability to build impressive machines. That wars are won not just by soldiers and weapons, but by people who ask the right questions and refuse to stop looking for answers. In the spring of 1941, as the Blitz was ending and the worst immediate danger had passed, Jones received a private letter from Churchill's scientific advisor, Frederick Lindemann. The letter thanked Jones for his work and noted that his efforts had likely saved thousands of lives and prevented the destruction of Britain's industrial capacity at a critical moment in the war. Jones kept the letter but never publicized it. He did not see himself as a hero, did not think of his work as particularly remarkable. He was, he insisted, simply doing what any competent scientist would do when presented with a problem: gathering evidence, forming hypotheses, testing them, and revising his understanding based on results. That this process happened to take place during a war, with human lives at stake, did not fundamentally change the nature of the work. This modesty was characteristic of Jones and his generation. They did extraordinary things but did not consider themselves extraordinary. They faced challenges that would seem insurmountable to later generations, but did not see them as insurmountable. They simply did what needed to be done, with the tools and knowledge available to them, without complaint and without expectation of reward. In an age of advanced technology and global surveillance, when nations spend billions on intelligence capabilities and employ thousands of analysts, it is worth remembering that some of the most important intelligence work in history was done by a small team working in cramped offices with improvised equipment and limited resources. That they succeeded is a testament to human ingenuity. That they had to work under such conditions is a reminder of how unprepared Britain was for the war it faced. The story of Reginald Jones and the Battle of the Beams is not just a story about technology or intelligence or warfare. It is a story about the power of rational thought in irrational times, about the importance of evidence in the face of assumption, and about the difference that a single person can make when they refuse to accept that something is impossible. On a quiet night in November 1940, 500 German bombers crossed the English Channel, guided by invisible beams that should have led them unerringly to their targets. Instead, many of them were led astray by false signals created by a team of British scientists and engineers working in secret, following the insights of a young physicist who had seen what no one else could see. The bombers still came. The bombs still fell. People still died. But the outcome was different than it would have been. Less destructive, less decisive, less apocalyptic. And in the mathematics of survival that governed Britain in 1940, that difference was everything. Reginald Jones did not stop World War II. He did not defeat Nazi Germany single-handedly. He was one person among millions who contributed to the Allied victory, and his contribution, while significant, was not decisive in isolation. But he saw something that needed to be seen. He understood something that needed to be understood. And he acted on that understanding with skill, determination, and courage. In doing so, he saved lives that would have been lost, preserved industrial capacity that would have been destroyed, and demonstrated that even in the darkest moments of the 20th century's darkest conflict, intelligence could triumph over force, creativity could overcome material advantage, and one person's curiosity could change the course of history. The beams are gone now, shut down at the end of the war, their transmitter stations dismantled or repurposed. The equipment that detected them is obsolete, museum pieces if they exist at all. The people who built them, who operated them, who fought their invisible duel in the electromagnetic spectrum, most of them are gone too, including Reginald Jones himself. But the story remains. a reminder of what is possible when intelligence is valued, when evidence is trusted, and when one person refuses to look away from an uncomfortable truth. It is a story about science as a form of warfare, and warfare as a form of problem-solving. It is a story about technology and humanity, about systems and individuals, about the destructive power of innovation and the protective power of understanding. Above all, it is a story about seeing what others cannot see, knowing what others do not know, and having the courage to act on that knowledge even when the consequences are uncertain and the stakes are unimaginably high. That is the legacy of Reginald Jones and the invisible war he fought and won over the skies of Britain in the desperate autumn of 1940, when the fate of the world hung in the balance and one young physicist's insight made all the difference.